I have had the privilege of being able to travel quite a bit in my 43 years of life. And sometimes people ask me, well, Pastor Jamey, what's on your bucket list of places that you want to see? And really, there's no cities on those bucket lists. If I never saw another city for the rest of my life, I wouldn't care at all. I really enjoy seeing natural things, beautiful mountains, waterfalls. I've been to Iceland twice, and Iceland is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Switzerland, another place where you just can't help be inspired, and you think about godly things. You look at the majestic mountains, and you're reminded of the one who made those. And really, there's not a whole lot of places that I'm just dying to see. I've seen enough museums. I'd love to see New Zealand. Love to see Norway, but there is a place called the Valley of Elah that I would love to see. Another high place on my list would be Mount Carmel. I would very much like to hike up Mount Carmel with my Bible in my backpack and sit down and read the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. I think that would be really cool. But this place, and I've not been to Israel yet. Someday I would like to go there. But a lot of these places, I've been to Turkey, and there's a whole lot of biblical history in Turkey. And you go to some of these places. I was on the Isle of Patmos off the coast of Greece, where John wrote the book of Revelation. And there's so much touristy garbage there. And they're like, here's the stone where John rested his head and slept at night. I'm like, you don't know that. That's made up. You don't know if he slept and put his head on that rock. And then there were other places there in these different churches, they would say, in this box is the right hand of John the Baptist that raised his hand before he baptized Jesus. You're like, there's no way you know that. There's a lot of this stuff where people are like, well, we think this happened here. And I've heard people say, they've been to places and they're like, this is the tree that Zacchaeus climbed up. I don't believe it. Might have been a tree in the area, but this place, the Valley of Elah, is 100% for sure the place where David met Goliath. 100%. In fact, the place where this picture is taken from, I believe, is where the encampment of the Israelites were. And the hill that you see on the other side of the valley is likely the encampment where the Philistines were. And I would love to sit right where this picture is taken and read through the story we're going to study today. Maybe even wander down in the valley there and look around and see if I could find a smooth stone to take home. You're probably not supposed to do that, but that's all right. Because what happened here is the site for one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. Turn with me in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to look at the story of David and Goliath. Let me ask you a question, just you don't have to shout it out or anything, but who's the tallest person you've ever met? Anybody met somebody over 6'6"? A couple people over 6'6", okay. Anybody met someone over 6'9"? Couple people. Anybody met someone an even 7 feet tall? Anybody met some 7-footers? Anybody met somebody 7'2"? Couple. How tall were they? Okay. It was a lady. Wow. 7-foot lady. I don't know what it is, but this last week I saw a whole lot of tall people. I was in the airport, and I saw a guy walk by me, and he had a shirt that said Pro Rodeo Rider, and he had to be at least 7 feet tall. Cowboy hat on and everything. I thought that poor horse, maybe it was a bull. The bull could probably handle that. Then I saw a lady walk by me that was like 6'5", and I was like, where am I today? So many big people around. I played a lot of basketball in high school, and I played the biggest guy I ever played against was 6'11". And it was in a playoff scenario in San Diego. And I remember the defense that we were playing, I had to go down and box this guy out one time in my shift. On the shift, when our defense shifted, I just happened to be the lucky guy that had to go in there and try and box this guy out. He was massive. I'm 6 foot even. So he had 11 inches on me, and this is exactly what happened. He didn't get called for a foul. He probably should have. But I got position on him in front of him and tried to back him up. He put his knee right in my backside, grabbed my hips, and lifted me up off the ground with his knee, set me over here, and jumped up and got the rebound. And I was like, that's ridiculous. That's not even fair. He was huge. In this story, we see a giant of a man. 1 Samuel chapter 17, it says, now the Philistines gathered with their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Sukkah, which belongs to Judah. And they encamped between Sukkah and Azekah and Ephes. And it says, verse 2, and Saul said to the men of Israel who were gathered together, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, which we are looking at right now, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and the Israelites stood on a mountain on the other side, with the valley in between them. Boy, it would have been incredible to watch that on this valley right here, and these two mountains, to see how they were all arrayed, maybe with their tents, because they were there for a while. And it says in verse 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath. Now, you might have heard the name Goliath, probably not with people, but maybe with a dog. I've seen people with like a giant mastiff. They named their dog Goliath. Or maybe, I've seen this one too, someone with a sense of humor has a chihuahua. And they named that chihuahua Goliath. The name Goliath means something huge now because of this story. A champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. There is some debate in theological circles about how tall this actually is. How tall do you have to be classified as a giant? This very likely, I go with the classic interpretation of what this is, because some people and a lot of times people try and minimize the impact of the Bible, and I don't like that. Some people have said, no, he was just like 6 feet tall. That's kind of what that means. I don't think so. When you look at this and the classical interpretation of how tall he was, very likely Goliath was somewhere around 9.5 feet tall. 9.5 feet tall. I believe Robert Wadlow is the tallest recorded man that we've seen in observable history in the recent times in the last 150 years or so. And he was, I think he was 8'7", 8'11", something like that. He was huge. You see pictures of this guy, and he's standing next to normal-sized people that are about this tall. Very likely, Goliath was up in the range of 9.5 feet tall. And he was a professional soldier. And he was undefeated, obviously, because he's still alive. This guy's never lost a fight. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had a bronze armor on the legs and the bronze javelin between his shoulders. So he's got a sheath down between his shoulders where this javelin is sticking up. This guy's armed to the tooth. Verse 7, it says, now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, or about 15 pounds. The shield bearer went before him. They stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Now, do you remember the description of King Saul in the Bible? How is King Saul described? The Bible says that he was head and shoulders taller than everyone else in Israel. He's their giant. And yet he's not volunteered to go out and fight this guy. And it's a pretty gutsy offer if you're going to accept it, because you look at your guys and there's not an equivalent for Goliath. And the stakes are so high that if your guy goes out and gets killed, your whole country has to become servants of the Philistines. And the Philistine, in verse 10, it says, he's quoted saying, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. What is he insinuating by saying, give me a man? He's questioning their manhood. None of you are real men. You won't come out and fight me. That had to be pretty hard to take for those men, right? It says, when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now we have a young man who shows up on the scene here. And it's a young man named David, the youngest of many brothers. And he comes back and forth, the Bible says, to bring his brother's supplies from his father. And it says that the Philistine, in verse 16, it says, the Philistine drew near and presented himself for 40 days, morning and evening. A 40-day standoff, longer than a month. Goliath comes out in the morning and the evening, insults the Israelites, insinuates that they're not real men, insults their God, and they just have to take it on the chops. Nobody's going out to fight this guy. David shows up. And in verse 17, we pick up here, it said, and Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news to them. Now Saul and they all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went to as Jesse had commanded. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. Right here in this valley, they were lined up, ready to fight. And there, verse 23 says, was the champion of Gath, Goliath, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. And so David heard these words. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. David is listening. He hears the horrible things that Goliath is saying about Israel and about Israel's God. And David's just a nobody. In the grand scheme of the family, he doesn't even get noticed. He's the youngest. David, it says in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, talking about this story, it says, unknown to Jesse, David's father, the youthful shepherd had been entrusted with a higher mission than delivering cheese. I added that last part. He'd been entrusted with a higher mission. The armies of Israel were in peril, and David had been directed by an angel to save his people. David, says verse 26, spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Nobody in those camps has talked like that. Who is this guy, and why isn't anybody taking care of him? Who is this heathen insulting our God? You wonder if people hearing him talk like this, if they're like, who is talking? Who is this guy? The guts on this guy to talk like this. But David's upset. David is concerned about the reputation of God. And as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, are we as concerned with defending God's reputation today? When people misquote God, misapply God's words, are we as jealous for truth, for God's truth, as David was for God's reputation back then? Are we as willing to stand up and say, hey, who's going to handle this? Who's going to straighten this out? Are we as bold as David to stand up for truth today? Now, in verse 28, David's there, he's talking words, or people are hearing his words. And his brother Eliab, it says, his oldest brother heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Those few sheep. Did you get that little dig? Who have you left those few sheep that Dad doesn't even trust you? You left the sheep? Not even a lot of them. Just a couple of them. I know your pride and insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. That had to sting a little bit coming from his older brother, right? Those of you that are younger siblings, how much do you like taking instruction from your older siblings when you were a kid? Or right now if you're a kid? Not so much, right? I'm a youngest sibling. I didn't like it at all. Likely David didn't care for it either. David doesn't bite at the argument. You see, sometimes the devil would rather that we fight against each other than against him. And squabble amongst ourselves and bicker and fight, which makes us lose focus of the problem at hand. David stays focused on what the real problem is. They've been there for 40 days, taking filthy insults, challenges. You know what no one has done so far in this story? Prayed. There's no priests there having church, having prayer meetings, praying for God to help them there. We don't see that here yet. It takes an angel telling a young shepherd to go out there and handle things, and he's not even on the site. In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 645, it says, he, David, was fired with zeal to preserve the honor of the living God and the credit of his people. David was fired up. How often do we approach our Goliaths without prayer, like the Israelites were approaching the real Goliath? How many times do we see the challenges in front of us and try and work through it ourselves without remembering to talk to God about it? Jeremiah 33 verse 3 says, call to me and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things which you don't even know yet. So Saul hears about David's speech. Saul sends for him in verse 31. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go out and fight this Philistine. Now, what do you think Saul thought when he saw David? And David said this. Is David a huge, strapping man? Does he even come in with armor? He comes in looking like a shepherd. Saul must have looked at him and been like, oh, this is our best? I mean, I like where you're coming from, but come on, man. We got to be realistic here. Isn't that funny how we always just think about possibilities within our human framework? We never think about the possibilities of what God might come up with. So often we have blinders just like Saul had blinders, and we look at the things in front of us and we think there's no way, and yet maybe we just haven't consulted with God yet. Let's see what he has to say. I love David's stuff. He says, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go fight with this Philistine. Saul said to David, you are not able to go up to this Philistine and fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. He says, you're just a young kid. You know, one of the biggest things we can take away from this, I'm going to aim this at all the young people and the kids today in church. Don't let anyone ever stop you because you're a kid, because God uses kids. God uses young people. And for those of us that are a little older, let's not forget that God uses young people. God uses young people. Saul says, you're too young. He wasn't too young for God to use. But David said to Saul, your servant, I love this part. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole thing. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from his mouth, and when it arose against me, listen to this, I caught it by the beard and struck it and killed it. Have you ever read that part and thought about, like, picturing exactly how this story went down? David, this young kid, he says, look, and these are not like mountain lions. That'd be pretty good enough. At that time there, they had like the African-style lions, the manes. I've seen these things in Africa. They're huge. I heard one roar one time, a male African lion roar. It's the scariest noise I've ever heard in my whole life. I could feel it in my chest when it roared. We were on the safari, and we pulled up, and there was a female lion. There was a whole rack of ribs right there that she'd eaten, so luckily she wasn't hungry, because we pulled right up, and the guy turned the engine off, and I was like, can we leave the engine running? This guy didn't even have a gun. He just pulls up to this wild lion and turns the engine off. Luckily, she was full, wasn't hungry. Her head was like this. And David here tells Saul the story. He says, look, I've been out sleeping out there watching sheep, and these lions have come up to take African-style lions, big lions. They've come up and tried to take my lambs. I've gone after them. He says, I caught them by the beard. What? And he kills them. That's wild. And not just a lion, a bear. David's like, look, I've been out there. God has been by my side. I've taken care of lions and bears. And he says in verse 36, your servant has killed them both, lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. He keeps on referring to him as an uncircumcised Philistine, meaning that he's a pagan worshiper of idols. There were all kinds of fertility things that went on in these idol worship pieces, and it was something that was always a temptation for the Israelites, but it was also a marker of their pagan rites. And he says, this pagan Philistine who mocks our God, I am not afraid of him. I've been in tougher situations than this. Moreover, verse 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said, go and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor. He put on the bronze helmet. It didn't fit. It was too big. He's like, I can't wear this. He took it off. Verse 40, it says, he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. Picture in this valley a little brook running through there. People are waiting to see an Israelite come down to fight Goliath. Nobody's crossing the line. Here comes David, not even dressed for battle. He goes down to the creek. Do you think any Philistines were paying attention by the time he got down in the bottom of the valley? You think anybody noticed? I think they did. This is the first one who's come out there. He goes to the brook. You think the Israelites are watching, by the way? Their future relies on this kid with a sling and a staff. He goes down, and David knows a little bit about the family of Goliath. And so do we because of the Bible a little bit later on. Goliath was a father. You know how many kids he had? How many sons he had? 4 sons. They were big, like their dad. We see that one of them almost kills David later on in David's life. So you've got Goliath, professional, huge, and you've got 4 sons, likely they're watching. David goes down to the creek. He picks up a smooth stone. Why a smooth stone? It's the best one to throw, right? Why didn't David pick up just whatever stones he could? You see, when we work hand in hand with God, God doesn't do things all for us all the time. Sometimes we have to put effort in it as well, and God works with us. He doesn't necessarily do it for us. There's expectation that we work with God. So he's still looking for the smoothest, best stone. Not just saying, well, whatever, God's just going to do it for me. No, God, I think, expects us to work with him and to do our best. So he picks up one smooth stone. And then he picks up 4 more. Do you think anybody was counting stones while they were watching? How many put away? 5 of them. Do you think those 4 boys were watching and counting stones and then looking, there's 4 of us and he's got 5 stones. There's really 5, us and Dad. I wonder if that clicked for anybody. Because this isn't a super huge valley. You could probably see what he's doing. And he goes and he gets 5 stones. He puts them in a pouch, the Bible says. And his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. Imagine that walk. Step by step going towards the largest human being he's ever seen, probably. So the Philistine, verse 41, the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Goliath probably needed his mouth washed out with soap. Saying all kinds of vile, nasty things to this young man. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." This doesn't bother David at all. He's being threatened right now by a massive man. And he says, "I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David doesn't, in verse 45, David says to the Philistine, he says, "You come to me with sword and spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Whew. I don't know if Goliath's ever been talked to like that before. Especially by a scrawny little kid who's not even ready for battle and just has a stick and a sling. David continues. Verse 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." I don't know that anyone has ever talked to Goliath and said, "When this is done, I'm cutting your head off." Whew. So it was, verse 48, that when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. What do you think the Israelite soldiers were thinking when they heard him say this? What do you think the Israelite soldiers thought when they saw this kid running towards, by himself, this whole army and this giant? Especially after that speech. There had to be just a little bit of fire starting to come up in those Israelites' bellies as they thought, you know what, he's right. Look at him run. Look at that kid go. David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone. And he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. Do you think the Philistines had just heard him say he was going to do that? Do you think he said it loud enough so that the armies of Philistia could hear that? Imagine in this valley, all of this taking place right in front of them, and he hits him in the forehead, and down goes Goliath. Can you imagine everybody in the whole valley, both sides are just like, what just happened? Down goes Goliath. David walks over, stands over him, takes out his own sword, and everyone's like, David takes out the sword, this huge sword. It must have been just about as big as he was. Raises it above his head. And in one fell swoop ends this whole thing. Cuts off the head of Goliath. And not only that, this is how crazy it was back then. Glad I didn't live back then. David grabs Goliath's head and walks off with it. The final sign that we've won, there's no coming back. I mean, the chopping off of the head of the people in Philistia must have been like, all right, guys, it's time to pack our bags and get out of here. David's walking around with this guy's head. What's your Goliath? What is the Goliath in your life? We all face insurmountable challenges in our lives, problems in our lives, things we look at that seem insurmountable, and sometimes we're tempted to look at things like Saul did. But at some point, we each have our own Goliath that we face in our lives. Maybe your Goliath is health problems. Maybe one thing after another, challenge after challenge after challenge with your health, and it seems like that's the only thing you end up dealing with. One problem after another. Maybe your Goliath is your job. You just can't stand it. You go in and you go to work and you're like, I hate this. Why do I have to do this? Maybe it's your boss at work. Hopefully not. That's not Pastor Irashira's Goliath. Maybe it's your boss at work who just rides you, who tries to get you to do stuff that you don't want to do, makes you stay late. Maybe for those of you that are students, your Goliath might be one of your classes. For me, my scholastic Goliath was math class. Oh, it was brutal. I had math tutors. I heard that you could go and if you passed the what was it? One of those tests in high school. If you got a good enough score, you'd never have to do math again. And I was like, all right, this is worth it. If I can just pass this test, I'll never have to do math again. I passed it, didn't have to do math for a while. Eventually had to do more math later on. That was my Goliath in high school. Maybe your Goliath is legal problems. Maybe your Goliath is marriage struggles. It just seems too big, too hard to work through. Maybe your Goliath is your ex. Maybe your Goliath is a bully at school. Maybe your Goliath that just seems so huge for politics, worrying about politics and wondering what's going on and who's going to be elected and who's not going to be elected and what's going to happen tomorrow and worry about it until it's just something you obsess over it. There are 6 things I want you to remember about the story of David and Goliath. 6 principles that we can learn from in David's discourse with Saul and with Goliath. The first thing to remember when you are facing your Goliath is to remind yourself of God's victories in the past. This is what David says in 1 Samuel 17:37. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. There is so much value when you are facing your Goliath and looking back at your life and saying, I've seen where God has been in my life in the past. You can look back and say, God was right there when I needed him. God helped me make this decision and look how it turned out for the best. When we look back at how God has blessed us in our past, we can look to the future and know without a shadow of a doubt that God will be with us as we face our Goliaths. David looks back and says, just like God was with me when I was facing the lion and the bear, God will be with me today when I face this giant. When we face our giants in life, just like God has been with us in the past, he'll be with us as we face them as well. The second thing to remember, ignore the angry threats of the enemy. In 1 Samuel 17:42 and 43, it says, and when the Philistine saw David, he despised him, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. It's easy to become discouraged, and one of the biggest things the devil will throw at you is your past. You're not worthy. You're not good enough. Look at all the times you have messed up. Ignore the threats of the enemy. Focus on the one who's been with you in the past. 2 more things of the 6 to remember. Put your confidence in God's name. 1 Samuel 17:42 and 43 says, you come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the God of the armies of Israel. David was not intimidated by what he saw in front of him because he knew that his God was more powerful and was by his side. I think sometimes we get a little overwhelmed with the Goliaths that we see in our lives, and we see them as too big. If we put our confidence in God instead of ourselves, we'll be able to handle our Goliaths so much better. The fourth thing, boast in God's power and character. 1 Samuel 17:46, he says this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. Now, you probably never thought of that verse as being an inspirational one. Be like, open up your morning devotionals, and you see this one, and it says, I will take your head from you, and be like, boy, that one's a good one for today. Probably never thought that way before, but the point that David is making here is that he's relying on God's power, not his own power. So many times we only rely on our own power to figure out our problems, and we forget that there is an almighty, powerful God right by our side. And that's how David is able to have this kind of confidence. Number 5, claim the promises of God. 1 Samuel 17:17, the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. He is very aware of how God saves. He looks back and he claims those promises of how God saves, and it's an encouragement to him as he goes forward. And he does a lot of this because he's doing it to point people to God, to remind them that it is this God that saves. In 1 Samuel 17:16, it says, I will give the carcasses of the Philistines to the beasts of the earth, that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Whatever Goliath that you face, you can know that on the other side of that, if you trust in God, there will be some sort of testimony that you can share about God's goodness to you going through this and facing your Goliath. And we'll be able to be an encouragement to other people, showing how God was with us. Oh, God will be with you as well if you put your trust in him. There's a testimony that comes out of this. So who is the hero in this story? The hero is not David. The hero of this story is Jesus, who deals with your giants. The hero of this story is Jesus, because Jesus was with David through all of this. I think David was probably pretty good with a sling, but I think God helped him be extra good that day. David seems like a pretty confident guy, but I think God gave him extra confidence that day by sending an angel, pointing him in the right direction. Jesus will be by our sides when we face our Goliaths. There's a young lady, I don't know if you remember hearing this story. Her name is Bethany Hamilton. She was, I believe, 13 years old and had been surfing since she was 8 years old. And I think it was on the island of Kauai where this happened. She was surfing, and a 14-foot tiger shark swam up and bit her arm clean off. She lost, I think, from what I recall, something like 60% of her blood. I'm not sure if that's possible or not, but that's what she said in her interview. And in the ambulance, she got to land. They called an ambulance, and the paramedic whispered a prayer in her ear while she was being taken to the hospital. And she loved surfing, wanted to be a professional surfer. How do you do that with one arm? How do you even get back in the water with one arm? How do you surf with one arm? How do you think about sharks being still in the water after something like this happens? And for her, this whole situation was her Goliath. How do I move on in life without my left arm? How do I get back into doing what I love and enjoy and have done most of my life? I've done it with my friends. How do I do this? And one thing that helped her make it through this, as you listen to her testimony, is that she believes in Jesus. And her faith in God helped her make it through this. Only 1 month after the shark attack, when she lost her arm, she waded out into the water with a surfboard to try and give it a go, and to see if she could make it with one arm and get back into surfing competitively. Can you imagine getting in the water for the first time after that? She got in the water, tried to catch her first wave, didn't even make it close, got tumbled by the wave. Going from swimming with 2 arms to swimming with 1 arm, it's very difficult. Even paddling out, you're paddling against the current all the time. Whenever you're trying to surf, it's like the ocean is always trying to throw you out of it. You have to be a strong swimmer. Now she's doing it with 1 arm. Another wave came. She tried to catch it. She fell. Did the whole washing machine. tumbled by the wave. Third time, same thing happened. And here she is trying to face her giant to see if she's even going to be able to do this again and have the courage to keep on trying. And the fourth time, wave comes. She's able to push herself up with the one arm, pop her feet on, and she rides the wave in for the first time since the accident. And realizes then that she's going to be able to do this. She's going to be able to make it and to continue surfing. And God helped give her the courage to not quit, to keep on facing this challenge in her life, which was a very real and huge challenge for her as a 13-year-old kid. 2 years after the shark attack, she won her first surf competition as a one-armed surfer, and was able, and is a professional surfer today as well, and an incredible surfer with one arm, which throws off your balance, throws off your push, your swim, everything. And she's been able to overcome this and has a faith that is so strong and encourages people in their journeys when they come across a challenge in their life to trust God to help make it through whatever it is that they're challenged with. My friends, today I want to encourage you, for whatever giant you are facing, to trust in the God who can help you make it through and face those giants. Proverbs 3, verse 5 through 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." Isaiah 26, verse 3 says, "You will keep them in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." David was able to handle this situation with poise and grace and confidence because his trust was in Jesus Christ. And friends, we will be able to do the same thing when we face our giants. We will be able to have peace if we have our lives in the hands of Jesus. I want to invite our worship team to come up. Our closing song is called "Standing on the Promises." And when we rely on God's promises, just like David did, we will be able to go forward in our lives, face our giants and challenges, knowing that we have an all-powerful God right by our side to help us make it through. Let's stand together as we sing "Standing on the Promises."